And we should be good to go. Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is Chris Reddy. Welcome to Western New York PhotoWalkers. We're going to have a good time tonight. We're going to go have a shot at this online meeting. We're going to try and do a whole session on the manual mode demystified. I hope everybody here has had a chance to get nice and familiar with your cameras, and we are going to be exploring some of the fun parts of that part of your camera that you probably haven't spent too much time with, and that's manual mode. So we're going to get started here in a second, but I just wanted to let you know, please feel free to leave a comment. Our faithful assistant, Rich Healy, is going to be looking at the comments. If you have a question, please post a comment, and Rich will get it to me, and we'll see if we can answer it. After this is done, probably sometime tomorrow, this presentation that you see me using here will be available on the site, or you can download it directly from photoready.com/master. Or if you have any questions, feel free to give me, write an email to me. My email is on there. All right, so let's get going here. So first off, there's the information for both the website where you can download this and my email address. So let's get a little bit into this whole idea of manual mode. And we all are familiar with probably a good number of the settings on our camera. Manual mode is one of those things that you can absolutely make great use of. However, it can be a little bit intimidating. So we're going to look at some of the things that you can do with manual mode, when you should use it, when you shouldn't probably use it. But we're going to take a look at what some of the people in our group have actually used manual mode, when they've used it, when they haven't. And we did a survey about 6 weeks ago where we asked basically what camera you're using, what model camera you're using. And then I basically asked everybody, how much do you use the shooting modes on your camera? The auto, the program, the aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual mode. And we're going to take a quick look at some of the results of this survey. About 100 people answered the survey. And the first one is for the cameras that we use in Western New York, and for our group anyway, about 50% of the people use Canons, about 30% use Nikon, and about 10% Sony, and everybody that's left uses a wide variety of cameras. So the number of people that actually use automatic 100% of the time, there's only about 4 or 5 people, and probably 28 people that never use automatic. But as you can see here, if you look at this chart, on the far left-hand side, you can see that the about 18 people use it 10% of the time, about 13 or 14 people use it 20% of the time, and then it spreads over. Very, very few people use it a majority of the time. Now we get into what most people are using most of the time, and that's the shutter priority mode. About, well, those for 10, 20, 30%, you get about 35 to 40 people are using that 30% or less. About 13 people never use shutter priority mode, and then the rest are 2 or 3 people use it a small percentage of the time. Aperture priority mode, probably the most popular because it's the most versatile, but there's a nice spread here, and a lot of people use aperture priority a lot of the time. Full manual is another whole story. Full manual, there are about 24 people that say between 80 and 100% of the time they use full manual as their main shooting mode, and that was interesting to me. Probably 70% of the rest of the people rarely use manual. Then I took a look in Lightroom. There's an option where you can get a plugin from a very popular author of plugins, Jeff Friedel, where you can take a look at what modes do you shoot in, and you can analyze the information in your pictures to a huge extent. So I looked at my pictures. the ones that I take with my current cameras, and I did a breakdown, and I saw that I use aperture priority probably 60% of the time, shutter priority about 15% of the time, manual mode about 12% of the time, and then some scene modes, action and portrait modes, testing. I use those a lot to show people how these different modes work. And then there was one that caught my eye here, normal mode, and that's the iPhone. My iPhone is included in this, and there's the normal mode in the iPhone. I've got about 13.5% of those pictures are shot in normal mode. So anyway, that's about what I figured, and our group is a little bit different, but similar shooting habits. So we're going to talk a little bit about what manual mode is, what it isn't, the pros and cons of using manual mode, and when to use it and when not to. So the bottom line is this: manual mode is all about manual control of your exposure. That's what it does. It gives you control over your aperture, over your shutter speed, over your ISO settings. However, the side effects of using one aperture or one shutter speed, the side effects is why you use manual control, why you use manual mode, so that you can get the effects that you're looking for with a particular aperture or a particular shutter speed. That's why you use manual mode, to give you complete control over that. So when you're able to choose the manual shutter speed, you're able to absolutely define when you're going to have blurry things, when you're going to have sharp and crisp things that are moving quickly. You have control over that. Very similar to like you do in shutter priority mode. However, you also have the side benefit of being able to choose your aperture at the same time. All of this is balanced out because you're also able to choose your ISO settings to give you the correct exposure. And that's what it all boils down to. You need to get the correct exposure, but this gives you complete control over how you get there. And whether you're going to choose your shutter speed first or your aperture first, or even if you want to shoot at a high ISO to get a particular effect, all of those things are yours to change and yours to choose in manual mode. But the bottom line is you still want to get the correct exposure that you're looking for any particular picture. Something that you may not know is that white balance is not affected when you go into manual mode. White balance is affected by the menu choice that you have on your camera. At least most cameras work this way. Some that I haven't seen may make this part of manual mode, but right now, if you have auto white balance chosen, that's the way it's going to stay. If you have manual white balance chosen to a particular color setting, a particular color in Kelvin degrees, that is not going to be affected whether you're in manual control or not. So white balance is not affected, focus is not affected. In other words, when you use autofocus, when you go into manual mode, you are still in autofocus. You are still using the focus system built into your camera. For digital cameras, it's very difficult by looking through the viewfinder to actually focus as anywhere close to as accurately as you can, as the camera can, when it's using the autofocus system. So in manual mode, you are using the autofocus system in the camera. You can certainly manual focus anytime you want, but it's not going to be anywhere near as accurate in most circumstances as the autofocus system on your camera. Obviously, composition is not affected. That's always your choice. That is always completely up to you, and you have complete control over that in any mode that you're shooting in. Manual mode is one of those things that you can use when you want complete control over not only the shutter speed and the aperture, but also the ISO. And you might want to force your camera to lock in at a low ISO so you get the maximum image quality that your camera can attain. And that low ISO is something that I'm going to explain a little bit about, because there may be some confusion about what ISO is and what it isn't, but it is part of manual mode, and it is something that you need to be aware of and will affect your exposure to a large degree. So when does it make the most sense? Using manual mode, for most people anyway, and this might be to the exclusion of those 24 people that said that they only ever use manual mode. In most cases, you're going to use manual mode when you have to use a long exposure. Long exposure photography like astrophotography, or when you are using a neutral density filter and you want a 30 or 40 second or 10-minute exposure. The light meters that are built into the cameras, just after 1 or 2 seconds of exposure, they just cannot get an accurate read for how much light is actually hitting the sensor. So any type of long exposure photography, my rule of thumb is, oops, sorry about that. My rule of thumb is anything over 1 second, I'm going to go into manual mode because I need control over the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO so that I can make the exposure look the way I picture it. The metering system in the camera is just going to be guessing at that point. It's just not that accurate for long exposure photography. Tied in with this, a lot of long exposure photography might be panoramas or HDR photography where you're on a tripod usually, and you want to make sure that the exposure doesn't change between your different photographs. HDR is usually 3, 4, 5, 6 photographs that you're going to combine after the fact. Panoramas, you might be stitching 3 up to 10 or 20 or 100 photographs to get a panorama, and you don't want the exposure changing in between those different shots. Another place there were a lot of times where you'll use manual mode will be an indoor flash. When you're at a wedding or you're at an event that is indoors and the photographer is supplying the light in terms of a flash of one kind or another, whether it's mounted as an external flash on a stand or on top of his camera on a handle. Indoor flash photography, a lot of times you'll shoot in manual mode so that your flash can take advantage of the features in the camera. There is, on most cameras nowadays, there is a TTL through the lens metering system. Some people like to use that. It depends on the camera and the flash that you use, how accurate that is. But a lot of times when you're looking at a photographer at a wedding, he's shooting in manual mode so that he's got control over the light. And in studio photography, the whole point of studio photography in most cases is to give you absolute complete control over not only the subject, whether it's a model or a product shot, but also all the lighting, the background, the foreground, any kind of lighting in that room, in a studio, you want control over that. So in most cases, studio photography will also be in manual mode. So let's take a look on most cameras now, and I'm going to concentrate where the majority of our people have cameras, and that's going to be Canon and Nikon. And we'll switch back and forth to there, and occasionally I'll have a slide in here that'll talk a little bit about Sony, but in most cases, virtually every camera, even within the same brand, you set these things differently. So when you want to go into manual mode, the process might be to set the dial on your camera to manual mode. You're going to compose the picture and get an idea of what you want to include in the picture. You're going to check the exposure of the shot with the light meter. You're going to look through the viewfinder and we'll show you what this looks like. But there will be a light meter needle that will be moving to left and right, and you're going to put that where you want it to get the exposure you want. And thankfully, because we're using digital cameras, you can, after you've got things lined up the way you want, you can just bang off a shot and take a look at the exposure. When you're shooting film, you can't do that, hence the beauty of a digital camera. So once you have the exposure you're looking for, and it may be darker than what the light meter would normally give you, it's up to you what you want your photograph to look like. However, after you're satisfied with the settings you've got, then you go ahead and you make the adjustments you want to get the effect that you want, whether it's a blurring of motion with a slow shutter speed, or freezing motion with a fast shutter speed, or a large depth of field with a small aperture, or very little depth of field with a portrait with a wide open aperture. You're going to adjust those things and then get the exposure you want. And usually, I won't call it trial and error, but it is taking a shot, checking the exposure, checking the composition, and then going in and fine-tuning it a little bit and taking more shots until you're satisfied you've got what you want. So you're going to adjust those settings and get the effect that you want completely in manual mode. Okay, So when you take your camera on Canon is always going to be on the left in these slides. Canon will be on the left, Nikon on the right. The manual mode, it's metered manually. Again, we're talking about manual mode is mainly having to do with exposure. You're going to set that dial that's on your camera, you're going to set that dial to M, whether it's on a Canon or your Nikon will have a dial that has an M on it. If you don't have a dial on the top, so you have a camera that has eliminated that dial, and this might be more of a professional camera or a camera that might have a display on the top, that display on the top, there's a button that will allow you to switch between manual, aperture, and shutter priority. That display is how you then set it on every other type of camera. One way or another, you need to be in manual mode. And across the world, around the world, manual is always designated by the M. So we're going to look at that. The metering modes, when you go into the metering modes on these different cameras, there's been a huge amount of work by these companies to develop an algorithm that will look at the entire viewfinder, measure the light in all kinds of different places, and come up with a best possible exposure setting in the other metering modes, the aperture priority and shutter priority. But it's still the same sensor that is looking at the entire viewfinder. Canon calls it evaluative metering, Nikon calls it matrix metering, but they are looking at the entire viewfinder and then using an algorithm that they've developed, coming up with an exposure that that they feel is going to give you the best possible results. There are other metering modes on cameras. They have different names, but they're all subsets of that evaluative or matrix metering, whether it's a center weighted or partial metering or spot metering. Spot metering is always the smallest area, usually dead center. Only about 2 or 3% of the entire viewfinder is actually measured for the light hitting it. All these camera companies have different types of metering systems. The most useful ones are the evaluative and matrix metering, and sometimes spot, and we'll talk a little bit about when you would use those. But in the metering modes, whether it's Canon, Fuji, Nikon, Olympus, Panasonic, Pentax, or Sony, they either call it zone or evaluative or matrix. That's the one that in most cases, under most circumstances, will give you very good exposure information. And it's that same metering system that is going to drive the needle back and forth in manual mode that you are going to use that measurement to determine what the exposure will be for your camera. So we're only going to be talking about evaluative or matrix metering, where it's looking at the entire viewfinder, not spot metering, not center weighted, nothing but the entire viewfinder. Okay? All right. So this gives you a little example of, for spot metering, it's only looking at the middle 2 to 4%, and then partial metering or center weighted metering basically looks at a slightly larger area until you get all the way to matrix metering or evaluative metering, where they're looking at the whole viewfinder, and they use things like, where is the autofocus point focused? Where is it that you are focusing? And they'll give a little bit more importance to where you are focusing, because the assumption is that what you're focusing on is important to you, and they want the exposure there to be correct. So they'll weight it a little bit towards where you're actually focusing, and then use some other things to give you a correct guess at your exposure. Okay, so when we actually look at the viewfinder display, there's all kinds of stuff on the bottom, and it can get confusing. If you ever look in your manual and you see all the different icons that are on the bottom of the display that can light up in different modes, it's a little ridiculous. However, in almost all cases, as you look through the viewfinder, in the very, very center of that, there will be a scale. And that scale will have the, let me turn this on here. It'll have a scale here where the center is in the middle of the viewfinder on the bottom, and then it will go to the left 1, 2, or 3 stops, and to the right 1, 2, or 3 stops or increments. In almost all cases, to the right is brighter, to the left is darker. think of right-handed people being brighter and left-handed people being darker. Just kidding, just kidding. But left is darker, right is brighter. Okay? And the same thing on Nikon. The first screen, this is a Canon, then we go to a Nikon, and the same thing. Adding to the right is going to be brighter, and to the left is going to be darker. And it's always in the center section. There's all kinds of other stuff here, but usually in the very center is this light metering scale that you can use to find out how the camera is metering light. And then to the left of that, obviously, you're going to have your aperture that you've selected and the shutter speed that you've selected. The backs of the camera, if you're looking at the back of the camera, they have all kinds of different displays, and they use the back of the camera a lot of times simply because they have a lot more area and they can show you more. So there's all kinds of, I know Nikon has some very graphical displays, and it gives you a lot more information. But when you're looking through the viewfinder, you're going to be looking at that center section so that you can see where the camera is going to be measuring the light and whether you're going to be too dark or too bright. And we'll look at how this will actually show up in your pictures. So this is a nice generic type of scale, and this scale is going to show you as you move to the left, you're going to be -1 or -2, sometimes -3 stops of light underexposed. Underexposed means it's going to be darker. 1 stop too dark, 2 stops too dark. As you go to the right, if the needle is pointing to the right, it's going to be +1 stop or 2 stops, or anywhere in between. But basically, as the needle moves to the right, it's going to brighten the picture. As the needle moves to the left, it's going to darken the picture. So the exposure indicator, and it can be either just a bar, or it can look like a needle, but as you will point your camera at different things, brighter and darker things, that needle will move left and right. When you're in an aperture or shutter priority mode, the camera will try and keep that needle in the middle by adjusting one or the other so that you end up with the correct exposure. Here, it all falls on you. You have to put that needle where you want it. Dead center will be what the camera thinks is going to be the correct exposure. To the left will be darker, to the right will be brighter, and you can determine how bright or how dark you want your photograph. Again, the whole idea with manual mode is that you are in charge of this, and you can determine how bright or how dark you want the photograph, and the side effects that you get by choosing one set of settings over another. So as an example here, if you look at this photograph, it's overexposed by at least a couple stops. It's way too bright. There's no detail in the child's face. Everything is kind of washed out. This is what you'll get when you overexpose. As your needle is pointing off here to the right, it's going to be overexposed. Conversely, if your needle is pointing off to the left, it's going to be underexposed. There will be no detail in the shadows. There will be no highlights. There will be no pure white in your photograph. Now, if this is the look you're going for, or maybe you're trying to get a silhouette, this is how you would do it. You would underexpose that photograph so that you're getting the effect that you want. But just realize to the left is dark, to the right is bright, and you'll be in good shape. So, correct exposure is going to be in the middle. You can determine by looking at the photograph, you can see whether I need to be darker or brighter. A point of caution here, and that is the LCDs on the back of your camera. Even though it might be an OLED display on a professional camera, it might be a very high resolution display, it might be a nice big 3 or 4 inch screen, they stink at actually giving you a clue of what your exposure is, because on most cameras, you can tell the camera in a menu, you can tell it to brighten that image or darken it by up to 5 stops. When you're out in bright sunlight, a lot of times you'll turn that backlight on the LCD way up so that you can actually see it. When you're in sunlight, LCDs stink. And when you're shooting astrophotography, you turn it way down so that you're not blowing out your eyes. You don't need much backlight because you're in pure darkness, or as close to it as you can get. So you really can't trust the actual display and take a look at it and say, oh, wow, that looks correctly exposed. You can't. You have to use both the exposure meter here, and we'll look at in a few minutes a histogram. The histogram you can turn on your camera. If you don't know how to get it, just look it up on Google or YouTube for your particular camera model, how you turn on that histogram display. And you don't have to have it on all the time, but know how to bring it up so that on any photograph you can see, is there a good distribution of light, or is it too dark or too bright? Is it overexposed or is it underexposed? That you can turn on, and the camera will be able to show it to you in virtually every camera I've ever seen. So one of the things that you can do, this is a good example of if your camera is set at 125th of a second at f/16 and the needle is centered on your metering display and you're shooting at ISO 200, if you make a change so that you open up your lens from f/16 to f/11, which is one stop, if you make a change, it's going to move that needle to the right, usually underneath that 1. If nothing else changes, it will be too bright, or it'll be brighter by one stop because you opened your lens up from a pinpoint f/16 to an f/11, which is one full stop of light. It's actually doubling the amount of light that's hitting the sensor. When you go from one f-stop to another, each one is either a doubling or a halving of the amount of light that's actually reaching your sensor. So right now, if you took this picture, it would be too bright by one full stop of light. That may be the look you're going for. Maybe you want it brighter than what the camera thinks, and that's fine. That's why you're shooting in manual mode. However, if I go from f/16 to f/22, one full stop from the top side, if I go from f/16 to f/22, leaving everything else the same, I'm now cutting in half the amount of light that is actually reaching the sensor, and the photograph will be too dark by one full stop. And I've got to do something else if I want to get that needle back to the middle. And the something else that I can do is I can either raise the ISO from 200 to 400, or I can cut the shutter speed in half from 1/25th to 1/60th of a second, and I'll get back to that middle section. I can compensate for that, but that metering index in the very middle of the bottom of your viewfinder is going to tell you where you stand. Besides looking at the photograph, this will tell you where you stand compared to what the camera thinks should be the correct amount of light. On a Sony screen, on the bottom, again in the bottom, there is the exposure dial, the metering dial. To the left of that is the aperture, to the left of that is the shutter speed, and to the right of all of those is the ISO. And you need to be aware on your camera where this information is so that you can, as you're composing, you can see if my picture is correctly exposed, if it's going to be too dark or too light. Again, especially on mirrorless cameras, if you're looking through the viewfinder is showing you an image so that you can see your composition. It is not representative of what the photograph is going to look like. They amplify the light in the picture so that you can actually see what you're focusing on. So it's not a good representation until you either take a photograph or you look at the histogram, and that will tell you whether it's underexposed, correctly exposed, or overexposed. So, for instance, the very middle of this would be correctly exposed. I've got a good range from pure white to pure dark and a lot of midtones in the middle. To the left is the underexposed version, and it is actually going to be way too dark. No detail on the shadows, just it looks muddy. To the right is going to be very overexposed, probably by at least 2 stops. There's no detail in the sky, there's no detail in the waves, there's no detail in the shadows. It's all blown out, okay? Excuse me. So, as we're all familiar with this, we've at least seen it. This is called the exposure triangle. There's a bazillion different versions of this, but what we're going to try and do is simplify it a little bit so that it makes sense. And if you've ever been confused by this, join the club. That's one of the reasons we're here, and you're listening to me hopefully explain this so that it makes a little bit more sense. So we're going to look at what affects exposure. We're going to look at some of the things that, as you change those settings in manual mode, the kind of results you should be able to see and why you would change from one f-stop to another or choose one shutter speed to another. So starting with ISO, and it is pronounced ISO, it's not an acronym, it's a word. So when you have low ISO, you have the best image quality your camera can manufacture. The base ISO is what it's called. The lowest ISO that you can set on your camera, that will give you the absolute best image quality, but you need a ton of light. The example I give, the best film ever made, in my opinion, and in most photographers' opinion, the best film ever made was called Kodachrome. And you could get Kodachrome with an ISO of 25. Very, very low ISO. Okay, so the low ISO will give you the highest image quality, and high ISO is better for low light. It actually lets you take a photograph, and the lower quality that you get from high ISO may be the trade-off that you have to take because there's just not much light in whatever you're photographing. Okay, the large aperture that you get when you're choosing a small f-stop number, 1.8, 1.4, 1.2, that large aperture is going to give you very shallow depth of field. Only what you focus on is actually going to be in focus. That gives you more background blur called bokeh. You need less light because the lens is wide open. It's showing you absolutely everything that it's letting in all the light that's possible to get. But the trade-off and the side effect is going to be how much of the photograph is actually in focus. So when you use a large aperture, only what you actually focus on will be sharp and crystal clear. Everything in front and behind what you focus on is going to be blurry. Sometimes that's the effect that you want. A small aperture where you close the lens down, it works like a pinhole camera, you're going to get a huge depth of field. A lot of the background will be in focus, the foreground will be in focus, but you need a lot of light. So the trade-off with a small aperture is going to be you need a lot of light, one way or another. As you use a lower shutter speed, you need less light. It's good for creating motion blur, but sometimes you want to limit how much something is blurred. You want that effect, but you want to control how much something is blurry. Again, you might have a beautiful composition, but if somebody's moving in that picture and it's blurry because you have a low shutter speed, it doesn't matter what the composition is, it's going to be distracting and they're going to be blurry and it will look like it's out of focus, it's just that they're moving. So a higher shutter speed, you need a lot more light, but it does freeze things in motion. Anything that is moving will be stopped in midair or stopped mid-stride, or depending on what you're taking a picture of, it will freeze motion. So if you're getting a picture of water and you want to freeze that water, you're going to be using a higher shutter speed. If you want to show that movement and get one of those a picture of a waterfall with water going over it, and you want that water to show that movement, then you're going to be using a slower shutter speed. And all of that gives you an idea of the effect that you want, the side effect of choosing one setting versus another. So when you choose a low ISO, ISO 100, you get the highest quality image that your camera can possibly produce. As you use a higher ISO, you end up with this digital noise, or what we used to call film grain. And when we're talking about film, that is actually the physical pieces of silver that you see when you use a very high-speed film. It has larger pieces of silver to be able to capture more light. A similar thing happens with ISO in that you get digital noise, but it's a whole different process. That noise that you get is a result of using a high ISO. So the rule of thumb is, as regards to ISO, you want to shoot with the lowest ISO you possibly can, but still get the shot that you want. Let me repeat that. You want to shoot with the lowest ISO you can, but still get the shot that you want with the effect that you're looking for. So if you're shooting in near dark or in dark, say you're shooting the Milky Way, you can't shoot at ISO 100. So in order to get the shot, sometimes you need to shoot at ISO 3200 or ISO 1600, 6400, depends on your camera. But to get that shot, you have to raise your ISO. Don't be afraid of ISO, it's your friend, but just be aware of, for your particular camera, what's the limit of your high ISO setting. And I highly recommend, anybody that takes one of my classes, I highly recommend that you take your camera, and when you take your camera, take it out and take a series of photographs so that you can determine for your camera, where does my ISO really fall off the cliff? Where does the image quality really go south? On this Nikon D5300, I've shot at ISO 3200, and the results depends on what I'm shooting on, but they're right on the fence. Some are really good, some they're all muddy and they look like the picture on the right here. So what happens is that ISO is going to affect the quality of your photograph. And for each camera that you have, you should take a series of pictures at different ISOs so that you can see where the image quality really goes down. And then try and limit yourself to that range that's good for your camera. Okay. So, again, as an illustration, high ISO gives you muddied colors, lower contrast, digital noise, some of which can be cleaned up in post-processing, but ideally you want to shoot with as low an ISO as you possibly can and get the highest quality image you can and still get the shot that you want. Okay? All right. So at ISO 100 you get pure color, you get absolutely gorgeous range of colors, dynamic range from pure black all the way up to pure white and everything in between. As you go up higher and higher in the ISO, not only does your image get muddy, but speckled. That's high ISO, and you want to try and avoid that. Okay? So you want to use ISO to your advantage. Don't be afraid of using it, but know what the limits are for your particular camera. Generally speaking, you want to, again, as I said, you want to shoot with the lowest ISO you can and still get the effect that you want. Okay? Something you might want to consider, and that's using auto ISO. Most cameras have an auto ISO setting on it that you can tell the camera, go ahead and use the ISO and adjust the ISO so that it can use that to affect the exposure. However, in full manual mode, you may want to turn this off. You may want to turn this on so that you can adjust shutter speed and aperture, but the auto ISO will make sure that you get the correct exposure. Turning it off, you have to set ISO, aperture, and shutter speed until you get the exposure that you want. Most cameras allow you, when you turn on auto ISO, allow you to set limits. Don't go above a certain ISO and don't go below a certain shutter speed. On my cameras, I generally have it set to not go below a 2/50th of a second and not go above ISO 3200. If I'm in weird lighting, very low light, I might adjust that. But that gives me a good range for my camera so that I can use ISO and let it raise and lower the ISO so that I can use the shutter speeds and the apertures that I want. Okay? All right. Now, I came up with this graphic basically so that you can understand how do you decide which to use. Oh, I'll just throw it on auto and we'll go from there. The idea is this. Ask yourself as you're getting out of your car, as you're going to go start taking pictures somewhere, is there any movement involved? One way or another. Fast movement, slow movement. Is there movement involved that I want to be aware of and I want to be able to control? If there is, then you're probably going to be shooting in shutter priority mode so you can control that movement, either by showing movement by using a slow shutter speed or by choosing a high shutter speed so that you can freeze action for sports or wildlife so that you now have control over that shutter speed. Shutter priority on Canon, TV mode, time value mode, or on Nikon and everything else, S or for shutter priority. Is there movement involved? You want to use one of those modes. If there is not movement involved, landscapes, portraiture, okay? then you're going to be probably using aperture priority mode. Now, these are not hard and fast rules, but it's a good question to ask yourself. If you're using aperture priority mode, you're more concerned about controlling the aperture, controlling the depth of field, controlling the bokeh. In aperture priority mode, that gives you control over all of those different aspects of your composition. However, in manual mode, you have complete control over all of those. So it's a good alternative to the other options where you can now have complete control of both shutter speed and aperture to get a mixture of those effects. But you have to make sure that your exposure is correct. You can't just willy-nilly choose, oh, I want an aperture of f16 because I want a lot of depth of field and I want to freeze the motion, so I'm going to shoot it in a 4,000th of a second. Well, you'll end up with a black picture unless you raise your ISO way up so that there's enough light hitting the sensors so that you will get a correct exposure. Now, here's what we're talking about, and this is what is, you may or may not have ever seen these. This is a histogram. These are available on all of the cameras. You can turn it on so you can see either live on the rear screen on your camera so that you can see before you take the picture where's your histogram, or on a picture that you just took, you can have this displayed so that it shows you what's the distribution of light here. So as you look at this, and all histograms are the same, the far left-hand side is pure black. It has a value of 0, pure black. There's no light whatsoever. The far right-hand side is pure white. The far right-hand border is pure white and has a value of 255. Everything in between is given a value of either 0 or up to 255. So as I take a picture with my camera, and the camera itself and the processor itself takes a look at it, and it says, okay, of those 24 or 36 million pixels, each one of them is given a value for brightness sake, from 0 to 255. 0 being pure black, 255 pure white. Every pixel in every photograph is given a luminosity value, a value of how bright it is from 0 to 255. The camera then takes that data and puts it on a graph that says, here's your distribution of every pixel in this photograph from pure black on the left to pure white on the right, and everything in between. Ideally, I want a lot of detail in the midtones. Again, for most images, a lot of midtone detail. I want to make sure that I've got some black, and I want to make sure I have some white in most photographs. So I'm going to have some distribution. There is no such thing as the right looking histogram. There's no bell curve. All of it, that's nuts. Every photograph will look differently, but it's the width of that you really want to make sure happens. You want to make sure that you're getting everything from the left all the way to the right in most instances. Okay? So, pure black on the far left. Then you have shadows, your midtones, the highlights as you move to the right, all the way to the far right-hand side of pure white. So, in this instance, you've got this photograph of a beautiful lake. And one thing I want to point out here, when they overlay a histogram on here, where that is on the photograph has nothing to do with its placement left to right in the photograph. So again, it holds true. Far left is pure black, and in this instance, what's rated as a number 1 is the black skyline where the hills aren't getting lit at all, and it's pure black. That's what will give you those peaks on the left-hand side of that white histogram. That's giving you a value of pure black. The number 2 there is all the midtones, the water, the sky, everything except the pure black and pure white. That number 3, that peak on number 3 is going to be the sun both reflecting off the water and in the sky. That is how you read a histogram. When you turn this on, you can use this as you're shooting to decide, where do I need to make an adjustment? Do I want it darker or do I want it lighter? This histogram will tell you. You don't want it smashed to the left side, it's going to be underexposed. You don't want it smashed to the right side, it's going to be overexposed. So you want to be careful with your exposure. That's what manual mode gives you complete control over. Okay? All right. So when you're underexposed, you lose detail in your shadows, you lose detail in your midtones. As it's overexposed, you lose detail in your skies, in the highlight. A proper exposure is going to give you a good distribution from the midtones to the pure black all the way to pure white. When we talk about aperture, and I'm going to jump through this pretty quickly because hopefully everybody's familiar with aperture and what it's talking about. So when we're talking about aperture, the aperture of your lens is what is controlling how much light is actually getting through the lens. The aperture is in the mid part of your lens in most cases, and it helps to control how much light makes it from the front piece of glass all the way to the back of the lens and through to the camera body. So as you go from a very small aperture, think of a pinhole, the aperture number itself is very large. And the reason for this is it's actually a fraction. So it's the denominator of this formula that they use to figure out how big is this hole that we call an aperture. Just like your eye, it opens and closes. The iris of your eye opens and closes. That aperture, the area of that is measured with a formula. I won't get into that. But that F number is the denominator. So if I have something that is 1/32 of an inch, that's much smaller than 1/2 an inch. 1/32 is f32, 1/2 is f2. Okay? So it's just something you're going to get used to. Apertures are expressed in terms of an f-stop. The bigger the number, the smaller the opening. Pinholes, big number, f32, f64. And again, when you go from one full aperture to, or one full f-stop to another, it's either a doubling or a halving of the light. Okay? So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the actual f-stop. As it shows in this, the smaller that number is, as I get closer to 1, the bigger the opening of the iris is, of that aperture. As I get a larger number, f8, f11, f16, f22, that aperture becomes smaller and smaller. Give you an example here. As I took this photograph, I get a good exposure on the left-hand side, and maybe I wanted to darken it, so I close my aperture down. It's half as much light in this middle photograph, and you're going to see that, oh, I lost detail in the shadows. And as I close it down even more, it gets darker and darker all the way to pure black. That is what happens when you change the aperture. It reduces the amount of light that is going into the camera. That's what aperture does. The beauty of it is, why you would choose one aperture over another is to get the side effect of choosing that particular aperture. And if you look at this photograph, it's focused on the word papstphoto.com. That word is always going to be in focus regardless of the f-stop that we're seeing here. But you'll notice the side effect that I'm getting is that things in front of that word and behind it are becoming more and more in focus as my f-stop number increases and as the iris therefore gets smaller and smaller, closer to a pinhole. Which is why I keep saying pinhole. Pinhole cameras, 100 years ago, pinhole cameras had no lenses. They were physically just a hole, and virtually everything in front of, from about a couple inches to infinity, was in focus because it was literally a pinhole. So they didn't need a lens. They just focused everything, and that's what very inexpensive point-and-shoot cameras and early camera phones used, is very small apertures to make sure everything was going to be at least partially in focus.
We got a question here, Chris.
We got a question. Okay, shoot, Rich.
So how come the f-stop, which is the bigger opening, why are those lenses so expensive?
Good question. More expensive lenses have physically more glass. If you look at an expensive f1.4 or 1.2 image, lens, you're going to have a lot of glass. There is a big chunk of glass there that lets in a lot of light. They also use very expensive formulations of glass, fluoride glass and rare earth elements, to make that glass as clear as possible. But a lot of times you'll have a regular 50 millimeter lens might have a lens that's only a half an inch wide, and it's an f2 lens. You get to f1.4 and it might be a 2-inch piece of glass. An f1.2 or the Nikon Noct lens that's 0.95, it's a piece of glass that's this big. It lets in physically a lot more light. So therefore they charge more because there's physically more glass there. These lenses, you can get a 50 millimeter f1.8 lens, the standard lens that comes on a lot of kit lenses, kit cameras. You can get those for $50 because it's got 4 pieces of glass in it and they're relatively small, very simple. However, you can spend that Noct lens that Nikon came out with. It is $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 for a 0.95. It's supposed to be a beautiful lens. It's not one that you or I will ever see, but it might have 15 or 20 pieces of glass inside of it to focus all of the light in the right place. That's what makes them more expensive. Okay? Cool. Alrighty. So, another example here. If you look at the very center person on this slide, you'll see, not person, this Lego, that stays in focus. As I as I change my aperture, you'll see that more and more things get in focus. Okay, more and more things get in focus in front of and behind that center thing that I'm focused on. If I want to isolate, and this is part of composition, if I want to isolate whether it's a person's face or a thing in a crowded field, I can use a very wide open lens opening to isolate that person and separate them from everything else that will be blurry. So you can use aperture in manual mode to enhance your composition. That's one of the beauties of manual mode, so that you can use that aperture that you want and then get the correct exposure using shutter speed and ISO. Same thing here. If you have a messy background or a cluttered background that you want to get rid of, you can blur it out by using a wide open lens opening. That gives you a non-distinct background. It separates your subject from the background and helps your composition. Okay, when we talk about shutter speed, a shutter in almost all cameras, not mirrorless cameras, because most of them will have both a combination of physical shutters and an electronic shutter, but nowadays most shutters that are physical have a top shutter speed of about an 8,000th of a second, and is literally a series of blades that expose any one part of the sensor for that period of time. When you get to about 250th of a second, the entire frame is exposed all at once. But as you get into higher and higher shutter speeds, it's literally just a slit that goes through, and it exposes any one part of that sensor to that amount of light for that total period of time. Okay, this is a great video. It shows this is at 10,000 frames per second. This is a shutter, and it's literally a slit. And if you've ever heard of the term rolling shutter, it's because of this. And bottom line is, you're not exposing the entire shutter all at one time. Things just aren't physically fast enough. That's one advantage of an electronic shutter, is the camera is saying, okay, read the information off the sensor for this period of time and read it all at once. So you get instead of a physical slit going by, it's just capturing the data for a very very short period of time. Okay, now here's an example that shows, as I change my aperture and I close it down, in order to keep the same exposure, I need to change my shutter speed to keep the same exposure. So when my lens is wide open at f2.8, I can use a very fast shutter speed. However, as I close down my lens and I restrict the light that's coming to the sensor, I need to compensate by using a longer and longer shutter speed. This is what happens when you're in aperture priority mode. The camera automatically adjusts the shutter speed as you open and close your lens, so that you get the exact same exposure that the meter is reading through that matrix mode or that evaluative metering, where it will give you what its guess is the best possible exposure. But it's a constant back and forth between aperture and shutter speed. So as the numbers get bigger, the pinhole gets smaller. When we're talking about aperture, the side effect, the bottom line, why you would choose one aperture over another is what's called depth of field. How much is going to be in focus besides what I'm focusing on, how much will actually be in focus. If I want something in the foreground and the background therein to be in focus, I want to use a smaller lens opening. Okay, if I want to isolate them from the background, I open my lens wide open. And then I make sure, if I'm in manual mode, I make sure that the meter is placed somewhere in the middle by choosing a shutter speed that gets that needle, that metering needle, in the middle. Depth of field, great example here. As I close my lens down, more and more things beyond and behind and in front of what I'm focusing on are actually in focus. Okay, great example here. 3 shots, f1.8, I want to isolate my subject from the background. I choose f1.8 so that only they are in focus. The background is a blur. However, if I want to show some of the context of where they are, close my lens down, maybe f8, f11, starts to show the background. The background starts to become less and less out of focus until I get all the way closed down to that pinhole, and everything from the person's nose to the buildings in the background are all in focus. Even though I still am focusing on that person, I can choose for my composition to either include or exclude that background based on the lens opening that I'm using. Okay, same thing whether you're doing macro photography of flowers. If you want to blur out the background because you can't control it, it's a flower that you don't want to pick and then photograph it and throw it away. You want to leave it there, but you want to control the background. Open your lens wide open, blur out the background. If you want to include the background so that it becomes more of the photograph, becomes more a part of the photograph, you stop your lens down, check your metering to get the right exposure by changing the shutter speed and get that metering needle in the middle. The side effect that you're going for with shutter speed is going to be you're trying to control the motion. The side effect, slower motion, slower shutter speed shows motion. Faster shutter speed freezes the motion. That one most people have no problem with. The side effect that we go for shutter speed lets me choose how much blur I want from something moving. Okay? So, in this photograph at a 1/125th of a second, this girl is obviously on a playground. I can see the background. She's smiling. All of these are focused on this girl. Cute picture, correct exposure. However, at a 30th of a second, the background becomes less and less clear, and I'm starting to get a certain effect. When I actually go to an 1/8 of a second, you can actually tell the photographer is sitting on this carousel with the subject, and the background is moving like crazy. That third picture at an 1/8 of a second gives you the composition that not only is it a cute picture, it shows that she's moving. She's not just sitting there. Like in the first photograph, they're all moving, but at an 1/8 of a second, you're seeing the background whiz by. You want to get off that carousel if it's you. Okay? So that's why you would choose one shutter speed over another in manual mode. Great example here. You use shutter speed to freeze the motion of this car, but you choose the right shutter speed so that it's not completely frozen. For instance, take a look at the wheels. They're a blur because they're moving a lot faster than this car is. And by panning with this car, you're showing the background is moving. If I shot this at an 8,000th of a second or a 4,000th of a second, the wheels would be frozen, the background would be frozen. This car may as well have been parked. However, if I want to show that this thing is moving and it's moving fast, you choose the right shutter speed. Now, you're not going to do this in 1 or 2 shots. Anybody that's tried this, trying to pan with the subject, you take a bunch of shots. Thankfully, it's digital. Okay, so once you've mastered this and you can now blur the background, get all the words sharp, you can show that there's motion, even though it's a still photograph, you can show that there's motion in the photograph by choosing the right shutter speed. 2/50th might be too slow, and 8,000th might be too fast. You find somewhere in between. And once you've got it, then you can get the picture that you really want. Same thing, propellers on planes. We don't see a lot of propellers nowadays unless you go to an air show, but you want to show those propellers moving. If they're frozen, the plane looks like it's going to fall out of the air, so you don't want that. Same thing, when you're talking about freezing water, sometimes you want to show water. However, when I look at a photograph like this is not how our eyes see water, because we can't make out these individual droplets like this. Our eyes see things as a blur. So I much prefer this kind of a photograph where you show that there's motion. It has a whole different mood compared, it's the exact same view, but I like the second photograph where it actually shows some motion. And you can try both, depends on the look you're going for. But in manual mode, you can control the shutter speed so that you're able to get the effect that you want. Sometimes I'll shoot it both ways and I'll see what I like after it's done, after I'm done processing it. Okay? Alrighty. Sometimes, like I said in the beginning, when you want a very long exposure, you've got to be in manual mode. The camera just cannot read. It can't meter this correctly. It's beyond its capabilities. So you'll use manual mode so that you can dial in exactly what you want. I don't care about the freezing any motion here. I know that with the amount of light available in a dark night, there are lights in the scene, but I need a nice long exposure and I want everything nice and sharp. I want Mercury there on the left-hand side to be sharp. I don't want to shoot wide open, so I'm going to be choosing a f8, f16, f11. I'm going to be choosing a smaller lens opening so that I can get more things in focus, but that might mean I need a 30-second exposure. That's why we've got tripods. That's why you bring it along with you, so that you have that option of choosing a 30 or 45 or 60-second exposure and get the effect that you want. And again, in a photograph like this, I'm going to put my camera on the lowest ISO I can to get the maximum image quality, because I'm not trying to freeze any motion here. If anything, I'm trying to show a little bit of blur. Okay, so depending on the effect that you want and the composition that you want, you're going to choose the shutter speed and the lens opening and the ISO that will give you the correct exposure and give you the effect that you want. So whether you're shooting fireworks and you have your camera open for an 11-second exposure to capture multiple starbursts, that's the effect that you want. You can do that in manual mode, or you can also do it in shutter priority mode. If you're trying to show movement or freeze action, you're going to choose the shutter speed that is going to give you the effect that you want. You can do this beautifully in manual mode. When you're in an arena like this where you have pretty constant lighting, once the sun goes down, the lighting doesn't change anywhere here. You can go into manual mode and pick and choose what shutter speed you want to shoot. And if you're on auto ISO, the camera will automatically use the ISO to raise and lower to give you the correct exposure. Or you can say, hey, the lighting isn't changing. I'm going to take one shot, see where I can shoot at 500th or 750th of a second to freeze action, and make sure my metering needle is in the middle and shoot all night long like that. But if you change your shutter speed to actually show a little bit of blur, that's when you want to make sure that you adjust and check your exposure so that everything isn't either too bright or too dark. So the side effect of choosing a particular shutter speed is going to be the blurring or freezing of movement depending on the effect that you want. So if I want to show how angry the water is or how muddy the water is and I want to show that detail, I'm going to choose a high shutter speed to freeze that water. If I want to show that calm, peaceful water flowing over the falls, no sharp edges, that's where you're going to use a lower shutter speed so that you can show that blur. Okay? Depends on the effect that you want. Okay, so the side effect of ISO, the third part of that exposure triangle, the side effect of ISO is going to be image quality. Bottom line, image quality. Remember the phrase, You're going to shoot with the lowest ISO you can and still get the shot that you want. Okay? This is the best explanation I've seen about ISO, and it is a great demonstration here. When you have lots of light in bright sunlight, there's a certain amount of photons that are actually hitting the sensor. Photons are what light is made out of. That generates a large signal. Think of it as voltage. It generates a big signal from each of those 20 or 50 million pixels. They capture a certain amount that is converted to a voltage signal, and you end up with a great image, high quality image. When there's very little light hitting each of those pixels, it generates a very small signal. Well, to be able to see that image, that signal has to be amplified. The amplifier in the camera is what takes that signal that is generated by very little light, and it basically, think of it as turning up the volume. It turns up the volume, it amplifies that signal so that you can at least get an image. The more you turn up that volume, the more that signal is amplified. For a higher and higher ISO, that amplification has to go up. The more it gets amplified, the more noise you're going to get. It's distortion. If you think of an audio signal, anybody ever turn the volume up on your radio real loud? It doesn't sound as crystal clear as it does at lower volumes. There's audio distortion. Any signal that gets amplified gets some distortion in it. That will show up. You'll hear it when you turn up the volume too much, and you'll see it when you turn up the ISO too much. So the rule still stands. Use the lowest ISO you can, but still get the shot that you want. Sometimes if you're shooting inside in an ice arena and you're trying to shoot pictures at a hockey game, there's not much light in there. It might seem nice and bright, but there really isn't much light, so you have to use a high ISO. There's no getting around it. But you can still get the shot you want, and you want to test it and see, okay, what's the lowest ISO I can use and still get the shutter speed that I want to use to freeze the action. Okay? Okay. The last thing, and we talked about how manual mode does not affect white balance, and quite honestly, I'm surprised at people that are still setting the white balance manually. And again, yes, I know if you're shooting raw, you can always change your mind after the fact, so it really doesn't matter. However, it's always better if you're close, so that if you are shooting JPEG or you want to use the JPEG, you don't have to do all kinds of post-processing. But here's the thing. On most cameras today, any camera manufactured in the last probably 7-8 years, the sensor that measures the color of light, those sensors are extremely good. They've done a great job at figuring out what color light is hitting the sensor. Automatic white balance is a great place to start, especially if you're shooting JPEG, especially if you're shooting RAW. Auto white balance does a great job. Now, you can go through and you can change your white balance so it's incandescent or fluorescent or direct sunlight or flash, cloudy, shade. You can pick and choose those. However, sometimes, like fluorescent, have you ever been shopping at Lowe's or Home Depot and try and find an LED and come home with two of the same brand, same model, but two different color temperatures? They're all over the place, and you can't really see it until you put them side by side. Well, I found this out the hard way. I was shooting some kids, and not kids, I was taking pictures of kids in a gym, and the background was throwing it all off so that the fluorescent lights were coming up with 7 different color changes based on what I was focusing on. In most cases, though, under fairly static conditions, the automatic white balance on your camera will do a great job. And you can feel confident in leaving it in manual mode, leaving it on automatic white balance, and I highly recommend that. Okay, so when we talk about the pros and cons of using manual mode, when you're going into macro, you're shooting close-up of almost anything, you need to control both the shutter speed and aperture and ISO. The camera just doesn't do a good job, especially when you're using lenses and lens extenders. You might be at f32, f64, f96 when you're shooting macro. So almost always you need to be in macro or in manual mode when you're shooting macro. Night or low light, we talked about, the metering just can't handle it. Difficult lighting, backlighting, front lighting, high contrast. Think of this. Think of taking pictures of somebody in a spotlight on stage. Maybe it's your child and they're the lead in the play and you're trying to get a picture of them singing their hearts out in center stage under a spotlight. The rest of the stage is dark. Your camera doesn't know what to do with that. Put it in manual mode and you can adjust your settings, look at the back of your camera, see when it's right, see when the histogram is correct, and the exposure is accurate. But I guarantee you, that's the worst kind of lighting. Your camera will have no clue what to do with it. Action photography, a lot of times you need to change the shutter speed with very constant lighting. You need to change the shutter speed. You can do that. You can either have it on auto ISO or change your aperture as you go. But in action, a lot of times you'll either use shutter priority or manual mode. Portraits, again, like studio portraits, you're going to have complete control both of the depth of field and the ISO. Usually you're going to be, for portraiture, you're going to be shooting at the lowest ISO your camera will allow. Difficulty of using manual mode, fast changing lighting conditions. If you're shooting a soccer game and the clouds are going by and the light's going up and down and you're zooming in and out, that changes the amount of light that's hitting the sensor. Fast changing lighting conditions, you're going to be going crazy with dials trying to figure out what's the right lighting here. If the lighting isn't changing, you can use manual mode, but otherwise you're going to be shooting in aperture priority mode, or in shutter priority mode, so that you can freeze the action and the camera will use the lens opening and the ISO to give you the correct exposure. You also have to have a very thorough knowledge and know what side effects you want to take advantage of and what side effects you want to try and downplay, whether it's bokeh or background blur or blurry movement. You want to be able to control that. Manual mode, you gotta have to know it by heart and just completely know your camera inside out. Okay? So sometimes using manual mode, you're constantly looking at the back of the camera to see if your exposure is correct. That can slow you down. You'll be chimping a lot to be able to see, is this too dark, too light, or you're looking at the histogram. That can slow you down. So manual mode has its downside too. So when you need consistent settings, you're going to be like focus stacking or bracketing of photographs. You can use manual mode. Long exposure astrophotography, when metering is really inaccurate, you're going to be using manual mode. High contrast lighting, stage performance, like I mentioned, you're going to be using manual mode. To get creative control, say you want a silhouette, somebody with standing in front of the setting sun. Your camera doesn't know what you're trying to do. You can get that look when you're shooting in manual mode. You can take control over that and have complete control over the look of your photographs. So when I was talking about white balance, there's a lot of choices. You can go all over the place with white balance. I highly recommend shooting in auto white balance unless there's some reason not to. Okay. Alrighty. I think that's probably going to wrap it up for tonight. I think we're in good shape and I've covered what I wanted to cover. I hope that we got a lot of the things with manual mode cleared up. If anybody has any questions, or hey, I'm not perfect, I get things wrong, but I've been teaching this for a long time and I've researched the heck out of this and I am fairly confident that what I'm showing you is accurate. But hey, if you want to correct me, I'm all open for it. I'm always ready to learn something new. So I look forward to when we can get out of this this quarantine mode and hopefully get to see you all again. And I look forward to the next session next month. And stay tuned, pay attention to the Facebook page. We'll be able to get together soon. Have a great night, everybody. Good night. Take care.